Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Paes.
And today we are talking about your questions. This is a question and answer episode. So we have compiled some questions from listeners, and we're going to answer those questions during this podcast.
Yeah, every few months, maybe twice a year, we used to do these special Q&A podcasts. We did 2 in the past, and this is our 3rd one.
Yes. So, shall we launch right into some of the questions?
Yes, Beatrice.
So the first question that one of our listeners asks is, how do our parents' Enneagram types impact how our type manifests?
Do you want to start, or should I?
I can say something about that. I think that our parents' types definitely impact how our types manifest. I think, of course, that varies from person to person, as we all have different relationships with our parents. Sometimes we're very close to one of our parents, sometimes not as much. And I do think that our parents' types impact how our type manifests, in that it's a little bit like, I think of it as an overlay or a kind of layer of adaptation where you may actually show some traits of that type. For instance, my father is a 1, and 1 is one of my wings as a 2. And I would say I'm quite 1-ish. And I think I can look back and see how my father's influence and my desire for his approval and my way of relating to him shaped me a lot. So it doesn't make me a 1, and it doesn't mean that I'm extremely 1-ish, but it did have an influence on me. And I would say that the way I operate in different settings and at different times definitely tilts more toward 1. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why I don't think wings are as simple a topic as people sometimes treat them as like subtypes, that if you're someone who has a 1 wing. For me, as a 2, my 1 is going to be different because I had a 1 father.
Right. In California in the 70s and mostly in the 80s, some Enneagram teachers and students, they came up actually with a jargon saying that someone's parent of the opposite sex type would influence them a lot. So, for instance, my mother was a 9, and I would be called a 95 because I'm a 5, but my mother was a 9. And they already had this concept that the parents' types influence them in important ways, as most psychological lines explain to us. Now, I observe, B, that that is particularly high for some types, for some dominant instincts, and for some circumstances. For instance, when the person has an origin in a culture different from the place they live in. So the parental overlay seems to be even bigger because of a tendency of the parents to to um, to help the kid keep their original culture. So I observed that the parents' influence sometimes is bigger in that case. So, for instance, I was recently working with someone in Brazil, a client in Brazil, who had a Korean origin, and their parents were Korean. She was born in Brazil, and she had a big influence from her father because her father was really interested in her keeping the Korean way, although she lived in a very different country than Korea, Brazil. And I noticed how much stronger the influence of her father's type was for her. So I think that these things, like the parents type and the culture of a country, they bring in layers of tendencies for us that we need to observe. And other times, people absorb the energy of their parents and really behave according to their patterns. I think that it also links to trauma, to how fixated personality is for other reasons. So it's something to look at, but I do not think that that influences the core of who the person is. I think that the core is always the passion and fixation of one's own type.
I do see that for types that tend to merge or shapeshift in some ways, in regard to people they're in close relationships with, that this can also have an extra impact. For instance, threes are sensitive to what other people want them to be like. So you may have a three that displays either some aspect of their parents' types or some aspects of what their parents value, because they shapeshift into what others expect or want them to be. So there's that, or a nine can sometimes see themselves as another type or display characteristics of that type if they grew up very close to one of their parents. So I think it can be even a little bit more so for twos, threes, nines, but certainly for all of us. Like I've seen sevens, for instance, who had an eight parent who were a little more aggressive and combative and able to do conflict more easily. Because again, when you grow up relating to someone, it's as almost as if that accentuates certain characteristics that you already may have some of, but it heightens that characteristic, or it expands it, or emphasizes it or highlights it in a way that maybe it wouldn't be if you had a different parent.
Yeah, and some subtypes have more of this tendency than other subtypes of that type. So, for instance, sexual nines, I think, uh, have more of a tendency towards this than other nines. And I think that sexual dominance in general, as a general observation, have more of this impact than other subtypes. Now, it varies per type. So you mentioned three. I think that social threes have a bit more than other threes, like self-pressed threes, of that this tendency. And also like self-pressed fours. I see a lot of that with them. So yeah, it's a good point, and I'm thankful for this question.
And when you mentioned people in California in the 70s, saying, did you mean in the Enneagram community?
Yeah, I remember our friend Peter O'Hanrahan and his wife, Pat, they taught me this when I first did the EPTP. And they really used this terminology, which I found really interesting and good.
So the next question we're going to talk about is a question from someone who wants to know um, what it means to work with the Enneagram, in quotes. This person says, as a mindfulness practitioner, teacher, and student, um, he knows that learning to work with uh, our meditation practice or our minds involves developing a regular or sustainable meditation practice. When we're talking about the Enneagram, something that's a little bit different than, say, a mindfulness practice, what suggestions would you have about working with the Enneagram? Like, what does that mean when you're working with the Enneagram in a practical way to deepen self awareness?
Both for self and others, you mean, right?
Sure, but maybe let's start with working with ourselves. Like if you're someone who's working with the Enneagram as a way to become more self-aware, let's talk about that. As opposed to a practitioner or a coach or a therapist or a spiritual director who works with the Enneagram. I think that's a different meaning of it. But if you're just a seeker or someone who loves the Enneagram and wants to apply it to self-develop, what would you say what does it mean to be working with the Enneagram as a self-development tool?
I'll say a few things because this question inspires me to talk a lot, so I need to be careful. And I think we could have a whole podcast on this. So yes, for me, the Enneagram is more like a matrix or a frame of reference for us. So the two main dimensions of the Enneagram, which is the process Enneagram, the Enneagram of transformation of any given process and not only people, plus the typological Enneagram, which we've been talking mostly about here on our Enneagram 2.0 podcast. They both can represent a form of thinking of things and thinking of ourselves, understanding ourselves and life. So when it comes to this, working with the Enneagram means when you see a psychotherapist or a self-help author or a spiritual teacher saying something, if you use the Enneagram in conjunction with that teaching, you will be able to say, this works more for this type and less for this type. And for that other type, that needs to be adapted in this way. And for yet a fourth type, in a different way. And also, working with the Enneagram means discerning what is really important for us to prioritize in our own journey. It means not doing everything that we can do to grow, and instead focusing on our main challenges so that we get the very optimal results in the time we have during this lifetime. And I could say so much more, but these are a few things that come to me. What do you think?
So I think that first and foremost, working with the Enneagram means using it as a guide for self-observation, because the Enneagram type descriptions are very accurate in mapping out our patterns, or the patterns that we tend to be more conscious of, but also unconscious patterns. So it's a little bit like, watch out for when you do this, or notice as you walk through life how you tend to do this. And I think it does us a big service when we work with it in this way, because normally we become so used to our patterns that we don't notice them anymore. They become so familiar. It's like, the air we breathe. We don't really see the patterns that can keep us stuck and limit us. And so in a way, it's a guide for helping us be more keenly aware and conscious of the choices that we make, of the habits we're in, of the things that we always do, even when they don't work for us. They really shine a spotlight on what tends to be invisible in the ways we do life. So I think on one level, it's about self-observation. Now, Claudio Naranjo used to say, and others, of course, have said, that the Enneagram is not a standalone tool. So some people may only use the Enneagram, and I think if you're only using the Enneagram as a personal growth tool and nothing else, I don't think you're getting the maximum value out of it. For instance, I think the Enneagram is an excellent tool to use in conjunction with psychotherapy or a coaching experience or a spiritual direction experience, because it's like you're taking the insights that you gain from observing yourself with the Enneagram, and then you're getting support in delving deeper and exploring further, in asking why and understanding how did this pattern come into being and why do I react in this way every time. The Enneagram helps you see that you're doing it. Sometimes things that are kind of icky that you really don't want to see, but because the Enneagram is a holistic, a more objective map of human personality, It helps us see both what we tend to want to avoid or deny in ourselves. And that's how working with the Enneagram really means doing shadow work, and doing the work of unearthing unconscious patterns. And I remember when I was, learning to be a psychotherapist, we used to say, like, well, why is psychotherapy effective, or what does it do? And I remember a lot of what the answer to that question was. It's about making what's unconscious conscious. And I think the Enneagram helps us do that same thing. Although I think it works best when we're working with it and doing some sort of meditative practice, right? Because the Enneagram helps us notice and become more familiar with reactivity that we would like to ignore, deny, or avoid being aware of. But the more we meditate, or do meditative kinds of practices, the more space that creates inside us to be able to see that reactivity over and over again when it happens, and eventually be able to let it go or make different choices by being so conscious of the choices we always tend to make out of habit. And so create more inner space to be able to, at first, just keep noticing it, second, question it, and then eventually say, I don't think that's working for me. I think I want to make a different choice. And so by doing that, it creates a pathway for growth, for helping us understand and see what we do, and then explore it at a deeper level, ideally with the help of a psychotherapist or coach or spiritual director or counselor of some kind, or friend on the path, or relationship partner. The Enneagram is a jumping off point, or it's a guide, it's a map. But when we use it in conjunction with these other ways of working with ourselves and our inner process, our spiritual development process, our psychological development process, that I think is when it's at its most powerful.
A little bit following your line, I think a good way to understand how the Enneagram can be used with ourselves is knowing more about our personality as things we are not, but we have identified with. So using the Enneagram types dimension, saying how we have come to identify with something we are not, is really useful for us to see how we've been avoiding our real self. And I remember our beautiful teacher, David Daniels, saying, the Enneagram is not interested in putting you in a box. It's more interested in showing you the box you have put yourself into and how you can get out of it. And if we take the process Enneagram, as I said, one of the examples of this is our model on CP Enneagram Academy of levels of awareness. We recorded 2 podcasts on this, and we explained there what happens next in general for people who do inner work, and also in specific for each type, meaning that we can predict what is coming after what we are experiencing now, and how we can get ready for it. So this is another way of working with the Enneagram for ourselves.
Yes, and of course, it does have a whole additional meaning if you're a practitioner. If you're an Enneagram teacher or a psychotherapist or a coach who works with the Enneagram, I think in that way you work with it in another dimension, and that is using it as a tool to help other people become more aware and help them see their patterns, but in a similar way to making what's unconscious more conscious. Anything else around that? Because I think you're right. We could say a lot about this, but I like this question because I think we probably mention working with the Enneagram all the time without saying what we mean by that. So I think this is a good question.
It is
Anything else we
indeed.
want to name before we move on?
I think that just remind all of us, and we need to keep reminding ourselves all the time, that we need to work with self-acceptance, acceptance of others, and in the beginning, and for a long time, be very gentle with ourselves at the same time that we wish to experience things that don't come exactly from our egos. So it means accepting ourselves and others at the same time that we don't feel resigned w- with what our personalities, and we there then wish to go beyond it and have experiences that are more like out of the box.
Yeah, I think I want to say just one more thing about this, and that is, I think when we have a conscious intention to work with the Enneagram and we see it as a major method or tool that we'll use in our process, I think it's almost like it invites us to envision a path of development for ourselves. Because exactly like you said, when we learn the Enneagram, what we realize is we've identified with a personality or a persona or an ego that we are not, but we mistakenly believe that's all we are. So I think when we work with the Enneagram, part of what we're doing is we are recognizing that we've made this mistake and that we think that our personality habits, our ego structure, our defensive ways of coping in the world are who we are. And I think when we work with the Enneagram, what it invites us to do is to see like a pathway that moves forward or a vertical trajectory of self development that is going to take us somewhere else, that's going to help us recognize who we are not and eventually drop some of the ideas we have about ourselves, some of the habitual ways we have of being in the world, and make space for a whole new way of being that's much more in line with who we really are, or our true self, or a higher level of consciousness. So it's in a way a commitment or a conscious intention to move from a lower level of awareness to move to a higher level of awareness, understanding that for all of the 9 types and the subtypes, that pathway looks different. So like you said at the beginning, it's an individualized pathway for growth. And this is why when I was a psychotherapist, it was such a huge help. And I used to think of it as my secret weapon, is because I would immediately be able to envision a pathway of growth and specific things, interventions, ideas, ways of relating to my clients that would help them start to conceive of this path forward out of a kind of way of being that was actually keeping them stuck in life in different ways, and allowing the space to see themselves and experience themselves as something more than that and something more aligned with a higher level of consciousness and a truer version of who they really are.
Right. Yeah. And I guess I need to say that because what you've shared now is super important, I need to say that some other teachers don't come from the same perspective of using the Enneagram as such a transformational tool. They use it more as a way to identify what our personalities are and learn how to deal with each other and with ourselves without really willing to transform much. And we think that this is not the best use of the Enneagram system. And to use the Enneagram, we need to have this vertical dimension in mind.
So, some of the other questions we got that were really excellent questions, we talked about and realized that they would deserve a whole podcast on their own. So, I want to name a few of those just so people know that if we don't answer their question in this podcast, we will devote more time to it coming up. And that is, somebody asked a question, can you talk about the MBTI or the Myers-Briggs, and the fact that, of course, it's based on Jungian concepts, the cognitive functions or personality archetypes described by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst. Um, and can you talk about the Myers-Briggs as it relates to the Enneagram? What sets the Enneagram apart? What are the similarities and differences, etc.? We think there's a lot to say about this, and we are planning to have Antonia Dodge and Joel Mark Witt of Personality Hacker, and they are Myers-Briggs specialists, especially, I would say, in a very expansive and effective treatment or version of the Myers-Briggs, one that really conceives of it as a tool for growth. We really like their work. We really like them. And so we've asked them to be on a podcast coming up. So we will devote a whole podcast to that very soon. So another question that we got that we think is really important that we'll also be dedicating a whole podcast to is how trauma affects the formation of type and subtype and instinctual sequence. So how emotional or physical trauma might affect how our personality shows up in the world. That's a really, really important topic and something that we're studying and getting ready to talk about more. In fact, I think our presentation at the International Enneagram Association conference will be on that topic, if I'm not mistaken. So, one question that someone asked that I think you might speak to, because I think it's something that you mentioned in our Wings podcast, which is someone would like to know more about the theory that you mentioned about how one wing or arrow, I guess, is referred to as a soul number and the other a spirit number. And I remember you mentioning that, but I think you know more about this than I do. So can you provide more information about that theory that you cited?
Yes, so this comes from Oscar Ichazo. He said that the wing before our type, which is counterclockwise, is soulful, and the wing after or clockwise, our if we take our type, is spirit. And my understanding of what he meant about that is that when we go back to one wing, the wing, when we go counterclockwise, we get more compassionate feeling with depth, and sometimes even with sorrow. I think that's a little bit of what soulful means. And I find it interesting because if we compare this to the arrow line movements, one of the ways that sometimes the arrow against is described is as being the heart point. So I don't think it's too different, only that it's in the wing's path, not the arrow's path. And so imagine that we get more closely in touch with our hearts and with some higher level emotions potentially when we use the wing before. But then the actual expansion beyond our more human level happens when we go to the next wing, going clockwise, meaning that we really achieve a bigger spiritual experience, and we connect not only to higher level emotions coming from the soul, but also something connected to spirit, meaning that it, we are not talking anymore about a self. We are talking about a more objective awareness level. So it also had this view that the wings can be extremely transformational, on top of saying that each point is a result of the tension between the two wings. Now, this is a Chasso, and I don't think that the wings have this big potential, and I think that the arrows have more of this potential for growth, unless the person is using the wings not only associated to developing some new behavioral features uh, on top of their type, but rather using the wings as steps on a very big and bold growth journey. Like we talk about each of the point in the Enneagram circle in our levels of awareness model. I think that it makes sense then to see that transformation in a very interesting scale, like Ichaso used to say.
So it's a little bit like bringing in aspects of these types, these wing types that we have special access to because they're right next to our core type, almost as ways of getting in touch with a deeper level of experience or of who we are.
Yeah, but I think I would say it's more using those other points as inspirations to get in touch with those resources within our own type.
Mm, I like that. I like that because I always feel like people are outsourcing things to their wings instead of recognizing that they have latent capacities for those same things inside themselves. I wonder if it would help to have a brief example. Like, could you use yourself for an example as a five of how this might work for you?
I think that as a five, when I use my forewing in a very deep way, I can I can really get in touch with my heart, but not only because it's an emotional type and a heart type four, but also because I integrate something quite different than my normal tendencies. And in my case, it makes me come to the heart. But for someone else, like for a six, going to five could mean getting in touch with a whole extra degree of calmness and overcoming anxiety and being closer to some very positive emotions because of that. So I think I do have access to my heart going there, although because I value a little more the arrow movements, I tend to see that after going to eight, I can go to two and then really develop my emotions more on two than on the four wing. But I also think that when I go to six, I develop some very interesting and difficult things for me, like my own uh, capacity to take care of myself, which is not easy for me, especially because I'm a self preservation repressed person. And being fearful of things that are happening without just making that fear unconscious, which happens to me all the time. And sixes don't have the same kind of fear that I do as a five, which is fear of feeling. They have fear of other things, but they find it much easier to feel. But in practice, I think that vibrating in a lot of energy and strength with courage of living life without fear of life is something that fives need, and they can find that resource on sixes, and that is definitely something I would relate to spirit.
Hi. If you're enjoying the depth of knowledge offered in this podcast, you might want to stay in touch with us. Beat and Uranio offer professional Enneagram training, personal development courses, self-guided online courses, and they even have a membership platform with over 100 hours of content. Head to cpenneagram.com/podcast to learn more.
So let's do a couple of questions related to specific types. We have a question from someone who asks, for type 1, the passion of anger suggests it would be in conflict with the defense mechanism of reaction formation, which pushes anger down. Can you clarify how this passion gets expressed and if the defense mechanism of reaction formation works against it?
So, one interesting story that I sometimes tell is that this whole theory of the passions and the fixations, created first by Chasso and refined by Naranjo, both of them did that originally in Spanish and not in English. And in those Latin languages, including my own language, Portuguese, anger has two words, two different words to explain two different things. And there is one word that refers to anger that stays in the inside, and another word for anger that goes outside. So the original term for the one's passion is ira, which is anger staying in the inside. But it seems there's no good translation into English of this concept. So the English name was chosen was anger. So if you understand that it's anger staying in the inside, I don't think that there is much reaction formation against it, because people don't see it, and people in most societies don't see that as being bad. They don't see the self critic, the inner critic, and being harsh on oneself as being bad in society. They may say that it's not the best thing for the person, but it's almost like people look at people who are inner critical and say, oh, poor them. It's not that they are doing something wrong, though. That's my view. So I don't think that the true meaning of anger for once, which is anger against myself, leads to reaction to us forming a reaction against it. I think that it's actually not only that, it's anger is a natural result of having reaction formation. And let me explain a bit of that defense mechanism, although we had a whole podcast on defense mechanisms. Reaction formation is, for instance, when I have an impulse for pleasure, and I think that particular pleasure is not correct or is not timely, I push against it with an oppositional force, and I'm forming a reaction against it. So I think that because I'm forming a reaction against this impulse for pleasure, the end result is anger. So this is my take, but what is yours?
Yeah, I would say it a little bit differently. And I think we always have to remember when we're talking about defense mechanisms, these tend to be quite unconscious by definition. So the way I would put it is, it's not that the passion of anger is in conflict with the defense mechanism of reaction formation, which, as you say, is an unconscious process by which a threatening emotion is rendered unconscious, and then we actually express its opposite, right? So the defense mechanism of reaction formation is the way anger gets handled in ones, right? Because ones tend to repress their anger or otherwise go unconscious to it. Now, not all ones do it completely. As we often say, the self-preservation one represses anger the most. So reaction formation turns the heat of anger into warmth and friendliness, right? Self-preservation ones express the opposite of anger, which is kindness and uh, friendliness and benevolence, instead of saying what they really think and feeling resentful and angry and saying, I'm mad at you for doing that. They bury that anger and they express its opposite. So in some ways, the defense mechanism of reaction formation is the way that, or the method, the unconscious method by which ones don't express the anger that they really have inside. So it's a way of controlling the anger unconsciously, holding it back, because the main conscious coping strategy or idealized way of being or self-image that ones have when they're in personality or identified with their ego is it's good to be good. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm not trying not to make mistakes. I'm trying to be good and not bad. And it's bad to be angry. And so unconsciously, they don't become aware of their anger. And instead, because it's so threatening to be angry for many ones, they go all the way in the other direction and get really polite or very friendly or really warm. But that is only a way of expressing the inner conflict about anger. And so, as with all the types, one of the main things we need to do, or one of the main avenues for growth, is becoming more aware of the passion and the ways that it manifests and the ways that we avoid being conscious of it. So, what I would say is that this defense mechanism that ones tend to have as a predominant defense mechanism is the force that pushes anger down out of consciousness. And that when ones get on a growth path, what they need to do is become aware of their anger and learn that it's okay to be angry, and actually frees them to be more in touch with what they're really feeling emotionally, including anger, and to be able to find ways that express that without feeling bad about themselves for feeling angry or whatever else they might feel that they unconsciously deny or go against or push out of consciousness while they're trying to be good. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So how about one more type-based question? So this person asks a question about the social instinct in 4s and 1s and why it shows up differently for them. This person says, as a social 4, I don't really know how to bring down my dominant instinct when it seems to already be low. And what he means by that is when he avoids posting on social media, when he keeps a low profile, when he's shy as a social 4. What might be a good way to work on this? And I think it's important to ask this question because I think one of the things this question is pointing to is, I think, a misconception about the way different instincts, when they're dominant, express themselves through particular types. So it gives me an opportunity to say one of the things that I always remind people, which is the social instinct is going to look very different depending on what type you are, because there's a few things we can say about the social instinct that is universal. Focus on the collective, focus on what's going on with the group and relationships to the group of the person in question. But the social instinct is going to be very different in 4s and 1s, because 4s are very different than 1s. And when the social instinct combines with the type patterns of 4 versus 1, it plays out in a very different way. And one of the things that I'd love to ask you to talk more about is the fact that in 4s, the social instinct is a little bit upside down. It's a little bit not what you would expect. For instance, the social instinct in 4s can manifest as a way of feeling outside the group, feeling like a misfit, wanting to belong and be seen and understood by other people, by society, by individuals and collectives, but feeling like people aren't going to understand me, or I'm not good as other people. And so I need to kind of keep a low profile or not post things on social media, because as soon as I do that, I'll start worrying about how people are perceiving me and imagining that they're perceiving me in negative ways. So I'll just avoid that whole thing. And I'm talking a lot. So what do you think of what I'm saying, or what this question is asking?
Yeah, I'll get to your question to maybe, but I think the original question has actually 2 parts to it. One is, how come this happens? And the other part is, okay, so if it happens, what do I do then? So the first part, how can someone be upside down when it comes to an instinct? A simple way that I sometimes explain why is because while that dominant instinct has an energy going one way, and it's belly energy because it's pure instinct. It's going one way, like it's going right. There is an emotional force going left, going the other way. There's another energy that's not belly based, it's heart based, trying to push the person somewhere else. And the end result is an inner paradox, which happens for some of the 27 subtypes way more than others. And it's not better or worse, it's just a feature of those subtypes. So it's a difference between the belly base and the heart base energies and the direction of what these two parts of our psyche want for us. um, so this is why I think it happens. But as to the second part of the question, what to do then? um, so here's the thing: for a social four, there is the very same willingness to belong than any other social subtype person of all 9 types have. There is the very same shadow of superiority operating for the person, which is a very typical shadow for social dominance. And there is a very same tendency to see things systemically, to connect the dots and people and things as socials do. However, because they are forced and there is the passion of envy, it's almost like saying, this is what I need the most, and this is what I'm going to make sure I don't have, because I need to show the world that other people have that more than I do. That's envy. So because that happens, we need to see what is the feeling in the inside as different from the behavior in the outside. And I think there is a problem with some other Enneagram approaches that focus way too much on behavior and on external manifestation of things like the dominant instinct. And for me, whenever I think of instinct, I go immediately to the shadowy part and not to the behavioral part. So it doesn't really matter much to me that a social four is very shy in social situations. That is an information, it's useful, but the main thing to me is that person needs to see the shadow that got hidden of wanting to be the one. So I usually come to social fours and say, wow, if you think that everybody is looking at you and thinking that you are less, you must think that you're very important because everybody is looking at you. Right. So
Right.
I go straight to what is the actual shadow behind all of that.
Yes.
And talking about instincts must be something deeper.
Yes. And there's so much focus on how I'll be perceived in the group, or whether I'll belong or not, or whether I'll be judged, etc. And that focus is the essence of how the social instinct plays out for fours. Now, just to say a very quick thing about the original question is why the social instinct shows up differently in fours and ones. The answer is because fours and ones are different. And ones focus a lot on being right. And so the social instinct in ones shows up a lot about, I'm going to figure out what the right thing is, and then I'm going to model it for other people. And that will be my service to the world and to the group by showing them the right way and leading them out of their darkness. But for the fours tend to compare themselves to others, and they tend to notice what's missing in themselves, and how that leads to understanding or connection or disconnection from others. And so the social instinct plays out in that territory, in the territory of envy and things like that. So last question. Can you talk about tritypes? What are they and where do you stand on them?
Okay. I don't use the Tritype approach because I don't agree with the premises it's based on. I deeply respect all Enneagram teachers. I really like to confront views. I've been convinced many times of views that were originally different from my own, but at the very least, haven't been convinced yet by the tritype theory. And the reasons are that I see the arrow movements for each type and the arrow connecting points as very, very important. And I think that the tritype theory does not capture that much. The second thing is it's essential, absolutely essential in my view, to understand that while we have traits of all 9 points, we have only one type, meaning that we have a little bit of all 9 emotions, but only one becomes a passion, meaning that it controls us, we don't control it. We have all 9 forms or ways of viewing the world and the fixations behind the fixations, but only one becomes really this fixed belief that we call fixations. So I don't like when directly or indirectly a theory implies that we have to work on 3 points and not one. And sometimes I see also that in practice, students use that to avoid doing the more central work on themselves, which is always related to our type only. But yes, what do you think?
So the question of what tritypes are, it's the idea that we have a type in each of the 3 centers. One is our main type, but so we could be a 2-7-1 or a 5-9-3, and that in each of the 3 triads of types, there's one that we're fixated in. Now, this derives from an original theory from Ichazo's work that was called Trifix. And he had a very specific formula for figuring out your trifix. And his trifix approach was embedded in a very vast and deep system of self-development or personal transformation. So to take something out of Ichazo's system and change it, one of the differences between Trifix, Oscar Ichazo's original Trifix, and Tritypes is that it only went clockwise in Ichazo's work. So it's only, let's say I was a 2-7-1. There would be no such thing as a 2-1-7, but in Tritype there is. So there's double the amount of types. So there's a lot of Tritypes, and so it's when people refer to themselves as all 3. Now, in addition to everything that Uranio just said, which I totally agree with, I believe that what was sort of effective and essential in Ichazo's approach, this very specific formula of how you figure out the fixation in each center. For instance, figuring out which one you were fixated in the body triad, 8, 9, and 1, had to do with your relationship with your mother. To figure out which one you were fixated in the heart triad had to do with your relationship with your father. And the head types, 5, 6, and 7, figuring out which one that one had to do with your relationship to your siblings and the world. So there were very important and specific ways of how that's determined. And there was a specific meaning behind this that got lost, I believe, when the tritype theory came along later. Now, here's why I don't believe that tritypes are a very good thing to work with when you're really doing serious work with the Enneagram. One is, exactly like Uranio said, we could spend a lifetime working on our own main type if we're really doing serious inner work, and not be done with it, right? That's one thing. To say I have 3 types to work on, I think tends to act as a big distraction. it tends to get people stuck at the level of description, like saying, I'm a this type with a this subtype and this instinctual sequence and this tritype. It's like, okay, now you've got 6 things going on there, and what are you really working on? I almost never see people who talk a lot about tritypes doing serious inner work that shows. So again, that's a maybe thing. Another thing is I find that people outsource things that have to do with their main type to another type when they use tritype. So I've seen a 4 saying, oh, when I do this, that's my 7. And I'm thinking, why isn't that trait that you're noticing part of your 4? I think it's part of your 4, not your 7. And the fact that you're calling it part of your 7 is a big problem around you doing your work as a 4, because you need to realize that there's part of you that's happy and light. And the fact that you're disowning that by calling it something belonging to a different type is not necessarily good for your inner development. So that's those are some of the reasons why. There's probably a few more things, but let's leave it there.
And thanks everybody who sent us questions. It's always great to interact with you.
Thank you for listening, and join us again for our Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.